Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Larry Cripe. I'm a member of the IU Simon Cancer Center and a physician who specializes in taking care of people with blood cancers. We're delighted you can join us today. You may ask, why is a physician who specializes in blood cancer talking about communication? And it's basically because a number of years ago, I realized one of the more difficult tasks I engaged in each day was trying to communicate well. I first thought maybe I hadn't paid attention to lectures when I was a student, but I realized that there were actually lots of questions that were out there about how should we communicate well with people. And it was my great fortune of meeting Rich Frankel and Cottingham, who you'll hear from in a moment. And over the years, we have done studies together and had lots of conversations about why is communicating so hard and how can we do it better. Anne and I currently are actively engaged in developing digital resources to support communication in a project called the Cancer Care Roadmap Project. And it's my pleasure to introduce Anne, who has been an awesome colleague and collaborator over the years.
Thank you, Larry. I am a health services researcher with the Regenstrief Institute at the IU School of Medicine, and I have worked with Dr. Cripe and Rich Frankel on many studies over the years, frequently focused on communication, working to better understand how patients and families experience their trajectory, their journey with cancer, how they experience and understand their care, what are their goals for treatment, and what they want from their clinicians. And so I'm delighted to be here today to talk about some of these things with you. Our close colleague, Dr. Richard Frankel, unfortunately is not able to be here today due to a health concern, but we did want to briefly introduce him because we will be drawing heavily on the 4 habits of highly effective clinicians that he was instrumental in developing years ago, and that has been used now across the nation and really internationally as a way to train and educate physicians to interact in a way with patients that helps to provide the best care and the best understanding of what a patient's needs are, and come to some agreement with what the patient wants from the visit and what the clinician feels is important from the visit. We are delighted to be able to work with Dr. Frankel's materials, even though he's not here with us today. I think I'll just jump in a little bit to tell you about the 4 habits. And the 4 habits, as I mentioned, were developed to help train physicians to provide the best possible care for their patients and their families. The first habit is invest in the beginning. And what that means is it's important for clinicians to take the time at the start of a visit to really explore what is important to that patient. Clearly, there will be conversations about ongoing care and treatment during the visit, but patients bring to the visit their own concerns, could maybe concerns related to physical impact of some of the treatment that they're receiving, maybe concerns related to psychosocial issues, maybe financial concerns. There's a whole range of concerns that patients may have on their mind when they come to a visit. And it's important for the clinician to invite those and to explore both what's important to the patient along with those things that the clinician feels are priorities for the day. The second habit is to elicit the patient's perspective. So while the clinician is sharing their own perspective, their own thoughts about where care and treatment need to go, it's again critically important to open up that conversation to the patient, to understand how is the patient thinking and feeling right now? What is important to them, both in terms of where to go with treatment, but also what's important to them in terms of their wider life. What are their other goals and priorities that they're trying to achieve? These things can influence care and treatment. And in order to get a good fit with a patient's unique situation, it's important to elicit their perspective and understand what is important in their life. The third habit is to demonstrate empathy. Patients need to know that their physician is on their side, that their physician cares about them as a person and not just as a patient, and that their physician therefore is trustworthy, someone that they can entrust literally their lives to during these difficult times. And finally, the fourth habit is invest in the end. It's important at the end of the visit for the clinician to be able to summarize, here's what has happened today. Here are some of the most important take homes for you. This is what you need to know. This is what you need to be planning for. These are the important upcoming appointments. And to ask, what questions do you have? What are you still concerned about? What maybe have I not made as clear as it should be, so that the patient leaves that visit feeling comfortable, that they understand what happened and they know what's going to happen next. So these are the four key habits that Rich Frankel and I and Larry have used in training physicians over the years. Invest in the beginning, elicit the patient's perspective, demonstrate empathy, and invest in the end. And we felt that they would be useful for you all to know about and to consider from the patient's perspective then as you approach a visit. And so today we're going to really focus on the first of those four habits, invest in the beginning, and to think together about how are ways that the patients, families, and clinicians can work together to create an agenda for that visit that ensures that the highest priorities that everyone has to talk about, the biggest concerns on both sides, are considered and thought about and discussed during that important time that they have together. So I know from the many interviews that I have done with patients and families, trying to understand from their perspective what happens during these visits, what is their experience having cancer over a long period of time and with multiple visits with their oncologist. What are their thoughts about their important visits that they have? It's interesting. Many have shared that they don't bring questions or concerns to the visits with their oncologist because they don't want to muddy the water. They're concerned that the doctor will know what needs to be addressed, and they don't want to bring in any outside material that might deflect from that singular purpose that they consider so important. Others are concerned that they forget their questions when they get in there and are talking with the oncologist and are hearing a lot of new information, a lot of large words, new language, perhaps, maybe new diagnoses. They forget what it is that they came to their visit to really ask. Others are embarrassed. They may have questions that they aren't sure they want to share with their oncologist for whatever reason. Or they may have clear goals and thoughts about what they really want out of the visit and just decide not to bring these up for another reason. On the other hand, there are patients and families who do bring these things to the visit, and we're going to think a little bit more about how this can work. What makes creating an agenda with your clinician most effective for you and for the clinician. So Larry, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Anne, for that great summary. And I, of course, was exhibit number one in how easy it is to miscommunicate. I forgot all the things I said I would say. So I'll catch up with you. Anyway, I think fundamentally, as Anne said, our goals for today is really to think aloud with you about how can you make better use of the time that you spend with your oncologist. And we'll try to convince you on some level that actually thinking about coming with a prepared agenda is actually a good use of your time. That it will work most of the time. Now, it won't work all the time. So there are certain visits that things are not going to go the way, even if you're prepared for it. But that it is a good use of your time. It's likely to improve the visit from your perspective. And I think more often than not, you'll find that actually the physician is appreciative of the effort that you put into that. I know for me, often I worry that I'm not anywhere near what a person's expectations are. And so I think that, as Anne said, this is work that Rich and she has done in terms of trying to train physicians. It's well received. So we thought by showing you what we're trying to learn, or I'm trying to learn as a physician, that actually you setting an agenda is right, well aligned with what the clinician is trying to do anyway. In order to do that, what we're going to do now for some of the time before we start taking questions is I'm just going to quickly list what Anne and I see as 6 sentinel steps from thinking about the visit all the way to leaving a visit with a clear sense of what happened and what are the next steps. And then we'll go through each of them, and Anne will reflect upon some of her experiences with both clinicians and patients, and then we'll hopefully come up with something coherent for you all. So I think the first step is to set realistic expectations for the visit. I think of those expectations in terms of both what do I want to communicate to the physician I'm going to be with, and what do I want to hear from or know from that physician. So it's both sort of, here's what I want you to know, and here are the questions I have, perhaps. I think is about taking some time to organize your thoughts. Sometimes you won't have specific questions because you're not sure of the questions to ask, but it may be a big topic. And your physician and you can then figure out what are the questions that will clarify the topic for you. I think Anne and I both believe it's optimal if you actually bring something physically with you to the meeting. I think too often for all of us, when we have things in our head and we're in the moment, it's often they're very slippery and hard to recall. And then we'll talk a little bit about how do you introduce this when you bring it to the meeting, if you brought something. And then finally, we'll talk about thinking about how to keep track of what happened, and then make sure you have a good sense of what the next steps are. So we'll now march through those. So Anne, I'm curious. I think that we're both concerned about not putting burden on people who already have a lot to navigate. But what do you think about, what have you heard in terms of what are the expectations people have, and how might they clarify in their own minds what those are?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing that I have heard is there's a wide diversity of expectations. And so some patients feel their role when they come to these visits is to listen to the physician and understand what is being said. Others feel like they have a more active role, but their role is to not only do those things, but to be an advocate for themselves, to really speak up and share their own thoughts, their own goals. Many, however, are concerned because obviously the visits are limited in terms of time, and so may not feel initially comfortable bringing their own thoughts to the visit because they know time is limited, and they're concerned about taking any of that valuable time with their own thoughts and questions. But what's really important to share here is that's important. That's expected on the part of clinicians. It's important for patients to say, here's what I'm thinking, here's what I'm wondering, and here's what I'd like to discuss today. Now, at the same time, in terms of setting expectations, there's that realization that time is limited and it's important to prioritize. So identifying, as Dr. Cripe just said, by maybe even jotting down some ideas before the visit, what are the things that are on your mind? And then circling those things that are the most important, you definitely want to get answered at that visit, is a good way to begin setting your expectations for what may go on during that visit.
Great, Anne. Yeah, I think, thank you so much. Those are great comments. I think Go ahead. I do think it's important to prioritize, but really what's going to work best is that when you, with the physician, prioritize what can be accomplished in that meeting. So let's think about the next one, about organizing your thoughts. And I'll lead off with this one. I think many of us have great ideas. We know what we want, but then when we're actually trying to put it into words, it's difficult. So there are some resources, and Ann, maybe you can comment on this as well. I think family and friends are often an underutilized resource. And I think family and friends, you're talking to them all the time. When you're down, when you're up. And I think sometimes people might be well advised to say to their spouse or their children or a good friend, what have I thought about in this last month or so since I last saw my oncologist? What concerns did I share with you? And they may be a good source of those things that you should bring to the meeting or the office visit. The other, if you type in question prompt list on an internet browser, this is a concept where you can find a wide range of resources. There are some for specifically about certain diseases, but it's basically a list of questions that people in similar situations have found useful. So that's another option, to go out and just see what other people have asked about this. But I do think it's worthwhile spending a little bit of time thinking about it, especially talking to your loved ones about what has troubled you or what have you been looking forward to with that next visit. So Ann, if you have comments about that.
Right. Well, I'd just like to highlight your initial observation about the importance of talking with family and friends. Because in many of the studies that we have done, we will interview a patient and we'll interview a family member separately to ask them a little bit about what's the patient experiencing, what does the patient want, what are their goals. And it's been very interesting to see how carefully the family member has watched the patient, has considered the patient, and is usually right on in terms of identifying patient concerns and goals, and can supply additional information about how the patient is doing physically or mentally or emotionally beyond what the patient has shared with me. So I think that the individuals in your life who are going through this with you often do have important knowledge about your situation that it's worth asking.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And be prepared that they may say, well, you've talked about this a lot. And you say, oh, I haven't thought about that at all. I think sometimes the things that matter the most to us, we sometimes don't think we're thinking about them that much. Great, Ann, thank you. So then I'm going to, I'll take this position. I just think I often have the experience where I'll say to somebody, what questions do you have? What can we do today? And they'll say, you know, a minute ago, I knew exactly what I wanted and you walked in the room and it's all gone. And I don't think that's something unique to me, but perhaps. So I think it's about bringing something on a piece of paper. I would propose that it's important, a piece of paper that's large enough that notes can be taken on it. I think the thing that I love the most is when I walk in a room and the person has some questions and they have their copy and my copy. And that way that just gives me an opportunity, which I often take advantage of, to write things down, short little notes on it, and to know really what's important. So we'll get Ann's perspective on this, but I would encourage you, if you're going to do the work, to go ahead and bring a normal sized piece of paper with things on it and use that to organize a conversation. Now, once again, it may not be everything on that list is going to be discussed that visit, or your physician may be able to say, you know, all these questions are really revolving around this topic. Let's approach the topic slightly differently. Ann?
Yes, I agree completely. I've interviewed so many patients who bring this up again and again about the forgetting the questions when they go into the visit. But in addition to helping recall those questions, just the act of spending a few minutes to write those questions down may help bring to mind more issues that you're interested or that are important to you than that might come up if you're just trying to do it kind of off the top of your head during the day. The other thing that's sometimes important, depending on your comfort level, is bringing a family member with you. So that family member may, as we said earlier, be seeing you, be understanding some of the things that are going on with you in a different way, and could add something important to that conversation if there is someone who you feel comfortable bringing.
Yeah, I think that's a great resource as well. And I would just say, I think it sometimes creates some ambiguity, and it would be helpful to just set the ground rules, so to speak, that this person is going to ask questions or this person is there mainly to listen to. Because I think there are awkward moments when I'm in a room with more than two people where I want to make sure I'm connecting and answering questions for everybody, but I'm not always sure about who's allowed to ask the question, so to speak. So I think clarifying that would be helpful. All right, so the next one I think we'll spend a little time on is the idea of, okay, so to the extent that you're comfortable, you've thought about it, you've created a list, you've brought the list. And I just want to emphasize the list can sometimes be topics. So one of the resources Ann and I are developing is we start out with just a list of topics, because often it's just too hard to think about individual questions. And so you might say, I really want to spend a few moments talking with you about my future. And the trust that your clinician is going to be able to sort through that and to help you understand what you're really interested in talking about that visit. So that takes me to this idea of collaboration. And Anne has pointed out what we're all aware of there's a set amount of time. Now that time can expand based upon needs, but still there's a limited time. And so the idea is communicating your priorities, but also be open to the idea that the clinician may say, well, I think what we really need to cover is this set of topics or questions, and let's figure out when we can address the rest, or that there's not time. And so I think the idea that we're hoping to is that this prompts a brief discussion with your clinician about what will happen during that visit. Anne?
Yes, I think that's right. And I think it's often through that initial conversation that you both are able to come to agreement together on what really needs to be discussed at the visit. So the clinician is obviously going to have ideas before the visit about, here are the key topics we really need to touch on in terms of next steps with care and treatment and other items. But you need to, if you can, bring your side of that conversation to the visit as well. What is it that's interesting to you, important to you, concerning to you? And use those first few minutes to talk together to identify what are the key points that really need to be addressed during that time.
So, Anne, I think we have enough time. I'm going to put you on the spot a little more. Sorry. I think part of this is normalizing, and I think you alluded to this earlier, that sometimes people have questions that they're not sure, am I allowed to ask that question? Is that topic too not controversial, but is it going to be the wrong topic? I wonder if you could reflect for a few moments based upon what you've heard through all the people you've interviewed over the years, what are some of the topics that people might want to think about, even though they don't want to think about them, if you know what I mean?
Sure. Well, so there's a range of topics. So there are those topics that people really don't want to think about sometimes. And those topics are a lot of times focused on the future. How much time do I have left? How long will I be physically active? Will I be able to be physically active again? There are a whole range of topics that individuals kind of feel like they want to know the answer to, and also kind of feel like they don't want to know the answer to. And so those are issues that you need to reflect on yourself, and realize, is this something I'm ready to hear, or is this something I'm not ready to hear? So that's one set of issues that may be more individually dependent on where you want to go with that. But there are other issues that individuals really do want to hear about, but they may not bring up because they may be embarrassed about. So those often have to do with kind of psychosocial issues. Are you feeling depressed? Those could have to do with sexual issues, the impact of some of the treatment on your personal life. Those are the kinds of questions that patients often really want to ask, but don't always feel comfortable asking. And so we want to just share the importance of that. These are critically important aspects of your life that may be impinged upon by the disease or by the treatment. And this is where your oncologist can be your best partner in working with you to address these important issues so that you're living your best life every moment with this disease. And so if there are questions of that nature that you really do want to know the answer to, but you're a little embarrassed to ask, our advice would be do it. Because the goal, again, in terms of this care and treatment, is to help put you in a position where you're living your best life every moment of the disease. And that can only happen if your oncologist understands what it is you're struggling with.
Those are great points. Thanks, Ann. I really appreciate that. It's before we go to the last step, I do sometimes think it would be interesting if we could reimagine what this relationship and what happens in these visits is. It seems like we're set in a certain way of thinking about it. And one of the things I think about often is, I wonder how you could invest in the beginning in terms of when those really hard topics need to be discussed. Either the physician thinks they should be discussed or the patient and family. If you could establish a way of sort of waving a red flag and saying, okay, I don't want to talk about it, but now we really have to talk about it, to create sort of signals to one another that this is really what needs to happen in the meeting. So finally, it's just that in the final couple moments before we take questions, the other thing I believe in is that trying to figure a way how you're going to keep track of what just happened in the visit. And so once again, that's why I think in terms of bringing a full piece of paper with plenty of spaces for people to make scratches or, marks on it and write things down on it. A copy for both you and your physician, perhaps where you're writing notes and he or she is writing notes. But I do think the final thing we would encourage you to do is think about how will you pull back something, take something with you that's not dependent upon your memory, which I think we're all aware our memories are not as accurate as we want it to be. So Ann, what are your thoughts about that goal and how to achieve it?
I completely agree. We hear again and again, these experiences, even these visits, are stressful. Individuals are responding to difficult news or just responding to another step in a difficult disease. And it's very hard, if not impossible, to remember everything that was discussed during an appointment. And yet individuals want to reflect on that and kind of remember and know and think about what was decided and what are the next steps. So writing it down is critical. And whether that's jotting it on a piece of paper, whether that's bringing something electronic with you, that if that's easier for you to quickly take a few notes on, I think it's a good way for patients and families to feel like they are full partners in this process and they have a good sense of where they're going once they leave that visit, instead of leaving the visit with that sense of kind of dazed confusion because a lot was said and it's hard to remember.
You just made me think about something that I've not thought before. So I'm a note writer downer because oftentimes I'm very word oriented, and to organize my thoughts is to organize the words on a piece of paper. And I often say to people, oh, well, I'll write things down. And I wonder if I shouldn't say, go ahead and write things down, and then I can compare what I wrote down, what I said, with what they're writing down as a way to check whether I'm even communicating well at all. So I think I'll stop telling people they don't have to write their own notes. And why don't we close with any closing comments that you want to make, and then I'll make a few, and then we'll go to questions.
Sure. So I guess my biggest comment would just be to please feel the invitation to be a full partner in these visits, and to not be concerned or afraid to ask anything, because this is important. This is your life. This is something that you need to understand, to have addressed, and something that the clinician will welcome hearing, no matter what the question or the issue is. Bring it to the visit, and please feel comfortable asking.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful, that the way you said it, and I think it's critical. I think your experience with people, talking to people, is very informative. I would just say the same thing. It will be a good investment of time. It may not end up in the way that you imagined it would end up, but it will be a good investment of your time. And whatever happens in the visit, that you come prepared in this way, will be very informative to you. And, Rome isn't built in a day, and you have your relationships with your doctors, and this is going to modify things a bit. But I believe it's worth the effort, right? And I believe Ann's right. It is generally appreciated. All right. So I'm not sure how this works, but if we can have a question, then Ann can take a stab at it.
So I see two questions right now in the chat box. One is that, are these skills and subject matter taught in medical school or nursing school now? And so we can both respond to that. I would say probably variably. I know the 4 Habits is taught internationally in different institutions. I don't know that these are taught as set pieces within the medical school curriculum, although I have taught them to residents and fellows, so at a different level. So whether every single clinician has had exposure to these ideas, probably not, but many have. Dr. Cripe, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree that they're being taught to a level that is profoundly different, more often, more substantively than when I was in medical school a number of years ago. I would say that that's one small piece of this, though. And I think, as you know, Ann, your work and my work is really about developing resources that can support those conversations in the moment. Because one of the things I've learned in working with you and Rich over the years and thinking about communication is not communicating well is so easy. And even if you're in the best of intentions and you feel you have the best skills, the dynamics of a moment can really throw you off, meaning me as a physician off. And so I think not just skills training, but having resources in the that are there to help the patient and the family members and the clinicians are necessary. And then, are you aware of patient communication training skills programs available to new patients? So I would say for that, yes. So I would say that most patient advocacy groups will have either under question prompt list or patient education materials. The NCI PDQ maintains a whole range of resources for patients with newly diagnosed cancers, recurrent cancers, and the like. So I think there are resources out there. This has been studied, and the most effective communication skills intervention are patients, caregivers, and clinicians all at once. But I'm not aware that there's a practical resource yet to accomplish that. And I don't know what you thought.
Right. No, I would agree with everything that you said. There are some resources out there. You can probably find some online, if not through an advocacy group that you're already a part of. It is recognized in the literature as important in terms of benefiting your care.
Diane, there's another question if you want to take that on.
Sure. How might IU Health team members help drive the conversation with patients and caregivers to get to the bottom of what matters most and to help the patient and caregivers navigate to communicate with providers? That's a great question. So I think a couple things. First, having those conversations with patients and caregivers, asking them what matters most, giving them that opportunity to reflect and to think a little bit in conversation with someone, in the clinical field, I think could be a great benefit as patients and families, try to pull their thoughts together and think about, what do I really want to talk about at this visit, or what's really important to me right now, which of course can change over time and does change in anyone's life. And then also working with that, helping them to navigate communication with providers. Again, the more that IU Health team members know about patient advocacy and how patient communication is effective, the more they can share some of those skills with patients and families during their interactions and share tips, share ideas about ways that they can make that clinic visit more effective if that's needed, and can even talk to them about what their current experience is so they can identify with a particular provider interaction where a gap might be, and even individualize some of that patient empowerment so that it works well in a particular situation.
Yeah, I want to answer it slightly differently and say the following is that every team member, every person that touches, quote unquote, the patient in their encounter is critically important. And if you read patient narratives, you are quickly informed about how important the person who's helping with transport, the person who checks them in are. So I think to the team members of IU Health, who I adore and respect, I just want to say, you are setting the stage before when I finally see the patient in the exam room. So you're offering reassurance, you're offering encouragement, you're helping me keep them informed about how long the wait's going to be. You saying, do you have specific questions? And then being, as Ann alluded to, an advocate on behalf of those concerns is critically important. So I think that the team members are a huge part of what the experiences are and can serve as a great source of information to the physician. So I would say what you do is helping us to get to the bottom of what matters most. And you are already helping people communicate and navigate, and just keep doing what you're doing with the wholehearted commitment you have. And I'm going to jump to a different question because I think
Sure.
This one intrigued me. How do we make sure the doctor is considering the whole person rather than focusing on one easy to find symptom? So I'll take a stab at that, and then you can comment or I think just say that. I think, and practice maybe, or just gut check this with your spouse or your loved one. Just say things like, overall, there's no symptoms or no things that are bothering me. What I'd like to do is talk about more global things, or I'd like to talk about how I'm doing. And I don't mean by that whether I'm short of breath or not, but I mean, because I think what really we're saying is that how do you recognize the emotional and psychosocial challenges in addition to the physical challenges when we're also focused on the physical challenges? So that's what I would say. And without putting burden on anybody, I just want to share a quick story of one time I was taking over some people for a colleague of mine who left. And I walked in a room, and the first thing this person said is she said, "I want you to know about me as a person before we talk about anything else." And I thought it was lovely.
Nice. And I'll just underline what Dr. Cripe just shared. We have patients who have shared with me some of their strategies for doing this. And a lot of times that strategy is just talking about themselves and their lives and what's important to them during the visit, even when that isn't invited, so that the clinician begins to have a broader understanding of the patient. And that doesn't mean on and on and on, but mentioning, I really enjoy traveling. We're hoping that we can take a trip next year, or, my grandchildren are so important to me. Talking a little bit about what's important so that clinician who may be coming from a very busy day and maybe focusing mostly on kind of the biomedical piece of it, is invited to start thinking about the broader person that is in there with them for this conversation. So if not invited, it's okay to share some of those pieces of information and to help create that understanding in the clinician of you as a full dimensional person, even if that isn't asked.
All right, thanks. Okay, we're going to do one. I think there's, unfortunately, we can't address all the questions, but I think there's one that's really interesting to me. And that basically is describing a situation when there's a decision being made that's of some magnitude, and the clinician doesn't seem to be able to talk about multiple options, but just sort of focuses on the option that the clinician is recommending. And the question is, can you offer any advice to patients when doctors aren't open about their options or aren't answering the questions? So first of all, I say this with all due respect to all my colleagues, sometimes it's hard for us to get off of a dime or the opinion we're on. And if you're struggling with that, that may be the perfect time to have a second opinion, not because you're going to come up with a different answer, but it just may be that doctor can't explain that to your satisfaction. The other thing I think is to say to the person, okay, I understand that's the option that you're thinking about for me and the reasons you're thinking about for me, but what are the other options that you considered? And I think this is where writing down is critical, and just have that person write down those options, even the ones that they think are completely not indicated. And I think that will help you. And I'll let you finish up.
Right. No, I think that's excellent. And you can even be very upfront saying, I understand that you do not feel these are the options for me, but I need to understand them just as a person. And so could you just walk through them with me and help me understand, here are the other potential treatments and why these are not good fits. Again, if you don't feel comfortable with that, or if you feel that you're still not getting the information you need, absolutely talking to another physician about that, getting another perspective, a second opinion makes a great deal of sense.
I'm not sure what we're supposed to do now, but I know, and it's always a blast to talk to you about these topics and to think about them with you. And I've enjoyed that. And, I think we both sent our wishes for a speedy recovery to Rich and our appreciation for what he's accomplished in his career. For all of you who have joined us, thank you very much for your time. And we enjoyed spending this time with you.
Thank you all.